The road to the farmhouse is barely a road at all, just a rutted path carved through the Appalachian backcountry, where the trees lean heavy and the fog refuses to lift. Locals call it the Hollow, a place where silence feels unnatural, almost hostile. Even today, decades after the house was abandoned, the land still carries the weight of what happened here. The first time investigators stepped inside, they described an almost suffocating stillness. Dust clung to the air like ash after a fire. Wooden beams sagged, eaten by rot, and in the cellar, broken cribs lay scattered across the dirt floor. There were scratches on the beams, small and frantic, as if someone had clawed at the wood in desperation. One officer later admitted he had to step outside just to catch his breath. Neighbors had long avoided the Hollow. One woman told researchers she used to hear crying at night, the faint whimper of an infant carried on the wind. Another swore she saw candlelight flicker through the broken windows, years after the family had vanished. "It's cursed ground," a farmer said simply. He refused to let his cattle graze anywhere near it. But beneath the folklore and ghost stories, a darker truth began to surface. This was not just an abandoned house, it had been a prison. And inside, two young sisters lived under the rule of a man whose cruelty blurred the line between family and possession. Witnesses later recalled seeing the girls only rarely. When they did appear, their faces were pale, their clothes torn, and their eyes carried a hollow distance. They never spoke in public. They were never allowed near school. Most assumed they were simply strange children, products of backwoods poverty and isolation. No one imagined what was happening behind closed doors. In the cellar, investigators found a wooden rocking chair wedged against the far wall. Its seat was worn smooth, as though someone had sat there for years. Beside it lay strands of hair, tangled in nails that jutted from the beams. Forensic teams couldn't determine how long they had been there, but the chilling possibility lingered. Someone had been held down here, for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. By the time the farmhouse was finally examined, the family was gone. The man who ruled it had vanished, leaving nothing behind but whispers, rumors, and scars carved into the land itself. Yet every fragment of evidence, every broken crib, every scratched beam pointed towards something systematic, something that could not be explained by neglect alone. The Hollow wasn't just haunted by echoes of children. It was haunted by bloodline, secrecy, and the disturbing legacy of a patriarch who believed his own kin were his to control. And so the question remained, what exactly happened inside this house? And how could two sisters disappear into silence for nearly 20 years without the outside world noticing? The answers investigators would discover were far more disturbing than the folklore ever dared to suggest. In the shadow of the Hollow, the sisters existed more as whispers than as people. Neighbors remembered them only in fragments, pale faces half hidden by tattered shawls, hurried footsteps down the dirt path, eyes that never met another's gaze. They rarely ventured beyond the tree line, and when they did, it was only under the watchful eye of the man who controlled them. One shopkeeper recalled a fleeting moment. The older sister appeared at the general store one autumn evening, carrying an infant wrapped in cloth. The baby never cried. By the time she returned weeks later, the child was gone. "I asked after the little one," the shopkeeper admitted, "but she just looked down, almost like she hadn't heard me." No explanation ever followed. Others spoke of pregnancies that seemed to arrive in unnatural rhythm, one ending only for another to begin. The younger sister, barely a teenager when whispers first began, was seen more than once clutching her stomach, her face drawn with exhaustion. A midwife from the next valley swore she had been called to the Hollow on stormy nights, only to be turned away at the door by the patriarch himself. "He said they didn't need outsiders meddling," she recalled bitterly. But I could hear the screams inside. The land itself seemed to conspire in their silence. Few outsiders came through, and those who did dismissed the talk as little more than hill gossip, wild tales born of poverty and isolation. But to those who lived closest, the patterns were unmistakable. Infants appeared, then vanished. The sisters' bodies bore the strain, yet no records of births, baptisms, or burials could ever be found. Investigators, years later, would look back at this timeline with disbelief. How could so many pregnancies pass unnoticed? How could children vanish without a single trace? The answer, chillingly, lay not in oversight but in deliberate concealment. The patriarch had cultivated a world where secrecy was survival, and silence was enforced not just by fear, but by blood. A neighbor, now elderly, confessed to seeing the two women once at dusk, standing side by side in the field. Their dresses were torn, their feet bare, their figures unmistakably swollen with child. "They looked like ghosts already," he said, "like women who'd forgotten they were alive." Every account painted the same grim picture: two sisters, bound by more than kinship, living as prisoners in plain sight. Their lives were reduced to cycles of pregnancy and disappearance, their identities erased by the will of one man who believed he owned them. But as the rumors deepened, so did the unease. What happened to the infants? Where were they taken or buried? No graves, no markers, no memories remained. Only silence, and it was this silence, investigators would later argue, that concealed the most disturbing truth of all, one that would unravel the Hollow's darkest secret. Piece by piece, at the heart of this tragedy stood one man, the patriarch. To the outside world, he was simply a farmer, a landholder tucked away in the Appalachian fold. But within those walls he was judge, ruler, and predator. He was not only the sisters' brother, he was their captor. Court records unearthed decades later refused to print his full name. Instead, they cloaked him in cold anonymity, reducing him to initials. Buried in legal jargon, one phrase surfaced again and again: unnatural relations. Behind those words, witnesses whispered of deeds too disturbing to repeat in open court. Neighbors remembered his presence with unease. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved by years of labor, he was not a man who smiled. One farmer said, "When he looked at you, it was like he was weighing your worth, and always finding you lacking." His voice carried across fields like a command, sharp enough to silence conversation. Even grown men, hardened by backbreaking work, lowered their eyes in his company. Inside his home, his power was absolute. The sisters moved as though tethered to invisible chains, their heads bowed, their voices rarely heard. One visitor described how during supper he spoke, and they obeyed. If he told them to eat, they ate. If he told them to leave the table, they vanished without a sound. Fear was not implied, it was enforced. A former preacher from the region recalled that the patriarch often twisted scripture into weapons. He preached his own sermons, the preacher said, about women obeying, about blood staying pure. It wasn't religion, it was tyranny dressed in holy words. This warped theology became the walls of their prison, isolating the sisters not only from society, but from hope itself. Court transcripts revealed fragments of testimony from distant relatives, mentions of screams heard at night, of infants born without acknowledgement, of neighbors chased off with threats of violence, yet time and again no action was taken. In rural America of that era, privacy and land ownership created fortresses, places where lawmen hesitated to tread, and where horrors could root themselves deep. The man himself was unpredictable, his temper legendary. One farmhand claimed he saw the patriarch strike an animal so violently it never stood again, all because it had strayed too close to the house. "If he could do that to a creature," the farmhand whispered, "imagine what he did to them girls." And yet, when outsiders asked about the women, the patriarch would smile, a rare, unsettling smile, and say, "They're mine. Always have been, always will be." Few pressed further. Fewer dared return. The truth was buried beneath years of silence, fear, and carefully cultivated control. But every rumor, every fractured testimony, every hushed confession pointed to the same conclusion. The monster was not a shadowy figure lurking in folklore. He was flesh and blood, and he lived among them. The chilling question that lingered then and lingers still is this: how many knew the truth but chose to remain silent? Sion. The Hollow whispered of children who never had names. They arrived in secret, their cries muffled by the thick Appalachian woods, their presence marked only by fleeting glimpses, frail figures wrapped in rags, carried by sisters whose eyes never met the world, neighbors, the rare few who crossed paths with them, spoke in hushed tones years later. One farmer swore he saw a child with limbs too thin, skin grey like ash, and eyes that mirrored both mother and uncle. Another claimed he glimpsed a boy whose face was almost a replica of the patriarch's own, only twisted and small. The children were specters, there one season, gone the next. Folklore grew where facts could not. Locals whispered of shallow graves scattered behind the farmhouse, earth that sank in strange patterns after heavy rain. Hunters avoided the land, telling stories of dogs that refused to dig, tails tucked between their legs, growling at patches of disturbed soil. But no records exist, no birth certificates, no death notices, only silence, kept and passed on like an heirloom. A midwife, now long dead, allegedly confided to her granddaughter that she had once been called to the farmhouse. She described an infant so weak it barely breathed, its tiny fingers curled unnaturally tight. The patriarch, she said, stood in the corner, his shadow swallowing the flickering light of the oil lamp. When the midwife asked what should be done, he only replied, "It'll be taken care of." The next morning the child was gone, as if it had never existed. The pattern repeated. Pregnancies too close together, bellies swelling before bodies had time to recover. Neighbors noticed, whispered, but kept their distance. Rural communities understood that survival sometimes meant silence. To speak out was to invite wrath, or worse, to invite the truth into daylight. And some truths were too dark to carry. Anthropologists who visited the ruins decades later noted the strange absence of children's artifacts. No toys, no schoolbooks, no shoes small enough for a growing child. Only fragments, splintered cribs buried under dust in the cellar, and faint chalk markings on cellar beams, as though small hands had tried to count the days. In the courtroom, when records surfaced years later, testimony was fragmented and sealed. The term offspring appeared, but never names. Even the state seemed unwilling to confront what these births meant, what they represented. Generations folding in on themselves, bloodlines collapsing under their own weight. What became of those children remains a void. Did they die in infancy? Were some hidden away, growing up feral in the shadows of the hollow? Or were they buried so shallow that the earth itself could not keep them secret forever? The farmhouse has long since rotted into the ground, but locals swear the land itself still remembers. Some say the soil is too soft, too dark, as though it has been fed by more than rain. Others swear they still hear faint cries at night, infant voices echoing from beneath the earth. The question that haunts the hollow is not only how many were born, but how many remain buried. Their stories never told, their names never spoken. The sisters' captivity was not an isolated horror. It was a reflection, one piece of a darker pattern that stretched across rural America. For centuries, isolation did more than separate families from the outside world. It built hidden systems of control, where tradition became law, and silence was survival. In court records from Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, investigators later uncovered fragments of a repeating story. Girls married before they reached maturity, pregnancies concealed inside log cabins, and elders insisting it was family business when outsiders asked questions. Communities isolated by mountains and hollows built their own rules, rules that often turned daughters into property. One anthropologist, decades later, described the phenomenon as a shadow society of forgotten brides. In her journals, she recorded testimonies of women who had been given away before their 12th birthdays. Their weddings performed in barns, their grooms often uncles or cousins. Most of these ceremonies were never recognized by law. They existed in whispers, in Bible verses twisted to justify ownership, in the unspoken agreement that what happened within a family stayed buried there. The sisters in the hollow were part of this wider, hidden history. Neighbors recalled catching sight of them in tattered dresses, bellies swollen, their eyes cast down. They carried infants that seemed to vanish without explanation, and when questioned, they answered only with silence. Outsiders dismissed the rumors as hill gossip, too grotesque to believe, but those who lived nearby recognized the signs. They had seen it before in other families, in other hollows. The cruelty was cyclical. A girl married off young became a mother before she knew what motherhood was. Her children, sickly or malformed, rarely survived. If they did, they inherited not only bloodlines but the weight of silence, and the cycle repeated. Violence enforced obedience, shame ensured no one spoke, and rural distance kept the law miles away. One former social worker, now in her 80s, told a journalist that the system worked against intervention. "You had to drive 2 hours to reach these places," she said. "By the time you got there, everyone already knew you were coming." They closed ranks. They hid what they wanted hidden. She admitted that on more than one occasion, she turned around before reaching the cabin. Not out of fear, but out of futility. The sisters, then, were not anomalies. They were symbols of a broader truth, that America's polished myths of purity and family left no room for the stories festering in forgotten hills. Behind those myths lay practices the nation refused to confront, and yet the hollow where the sisters lived carried the weight of something even more disturbing. It wasn't just a case of child brides forced into unnatural marriages. It was a bloodline folded inward, a cycle of secrecy so complete that even folklore seemed unable to contain it. The question that still hangs in the air is chilling. How many other hollows, how many other farmhouses, hid their own brides bound not by choice but by blood? Decades after the sisters and their children faded into silence, the hollow might have remained a ghost story. But it didn't. The ruins of the farmhouse still stood, and with them, whispers that refused to die. It was enough to draw outsiders, journalists, anthropologists, and social workers into the hills. Each came with questions, and each left with fragments of a truth more disturbing than the rumors themselves. They started with paper trails. Old county courthouses in Kentucky and West Virginia held registers smudged with age. Birth certificates were missing, torn out or never filed at all. Death certificates appeared for infants who had no traceable parents, their surnames left blank or replaced with initials. An anthropologist noted, the absence itself became evidence. It was as if someone had scrubbed a family from the record, yet left just enough behind to suggest they had once existed. But documents were only part of the story. Neighbors remembered details that time couldn't erase. One man, now in his 90s, described walking past the hollow as a child. In summer, the air smelled foul, like sickness hanging in the heat, he told reporters. Another recalled seeing thin curtains drawn tight, never opened, even in the sweltering July sun. They said the sisters rarely spoke, but their silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, as though words themselves had been forbidden. Social workers, decades too late, interviewed distant relatives scattered across Appalachia. Their testimonies were broken, reluctant, and filled with shame. One woman whispered about babies that didn't last, her hands trembling as she described funerals without preachers, tiny coffins lowered into unmarked ground. Another relative swore he had seen a child, pale and frail, carried into the woods and never brought back. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became. Children born close together, too close to be natural. Infants who vanished, pregnancies hidden, and women who aged before their time. It was the portrait of a bloodline devouring itself, a cycle of secrecy collapsing under its own weight. Journalists who visited the site in the 1970s wrote about the eerie silence that still clung to the hollow. Grass grew high where the farmhouse once stood. The cellar door lay rotted open, its hinges rusted, revealing dirt walls marked with scratches, whether from rats or something else, no one could say. Some swore the faint cries of infants still echoed when the wind cut through the valley. Every discovery chipped away at the myth of folklore. This was no ghost story. It was flesh and blood, bones and silence. Yet the more the investigators uncovered, the darker the unanswered questions grew. How many children had been buried beneath that soil? How many stories had been erased from court records and family Bibles? And, perhaps most disturbing of all, was this hollow a single nightmare, or just one among many in America's forgotten hills? The story could have ended in silence, buried beneath dust, unmarked graves, and the polite denials of neighbors. But decades later, faint voices began to surface, not from officials nor from church elders, but from within the bloodline itself. Survivors. One woman, now in her 70s, recalled the attic room as if it had never left her mind. She described peeling wallpaper stained with mildew, a single window nailed shut, and the figure of a child strapped to a narrow iron bed. "It cried like a wounded animal," she whispered, her hands trembling. No one in the family spoke of it, but the memory followed her for a lifetime. Others remembered differently, yet with the same haunting weight. A man born into the same lineage told of a young boy barefoot wandering through the snow one winter night. His speech was garbled, incomprehensible, as though he had never been taught words. His feet were raw, purple from frost. "They said he was sick in the head," the man explained. "But I knew better. He wasn't sick. He was starved of love." These testimonies, scattered and broken, painted a portrait of generational trauma, fragments of truth buried beneath shame. No one wanted to be the one who carried the family's darkest secrets into daylight. Yet as decades passed, descendants began to speak in hushed tones, at funerals, at late-night gatherings, in whispered confessions to journalists who came searching. A neighbor's daughter remembered visiting the farmhouse in her youth. She said the smell lingered, stale sickness, as if the air itself refused to move. It wasn't just poverty, she recalled. It was something else, a kind of rot, like the house itself was keeping secrets. What emerged was not just a story of individuals, but of inheritance, trauma passed like an heirloom. Children grew up under the weight of unspoken rules, conditioned silence, and the unshakable sense that they were marked by blood. One descendant confessed to avoiding marriage altogether, terrified of repeating the curse. Another described nightmares of children with blank eyes, staring from dark corners of the house. But the most chilling testimonies came from those who claimed to have seen the hidden children themselves. A cousin remembered being led to the cellar as punishment. Down there in the damp dark, she saw what she described as a crib, old and rotting, but used. The implication was clear. Babies had been kept below ground, out of sight. For decades, these survivors carried the weight of silence, unsure if anyone would believe them, or if the telling would only stain their own names further. Yet, as one researcher later noted, the consistency of their details, the attic, the snow, the straps, the smell, was impossible to ignore. The survivors had not conspired. They had lived, and their memories formed a collective map pointing back to the same house of secrets. But if their stories were true, then a darker question remained: how many children had never survived long enough to be remembered? Time does what silence cannot. Dirt eats away at walls, weakens beams, and turns secrecy into ruin. The farmhouse that once stood as the center of this family's hidden world did not survive the century. Abandoned, its roof caved under the weight of rainstorms, its floorboards split with rot, and vines crept through the broken windows like hands reclaiming what had been stolen from the land. Locals say no one dared live there, not after the stories. Children would cross to the other side of the road rather than walk past its leaning frame. By the late 1990s, it finally collapsed in on itself. But its secrets did not stay buried. When the wreckage was sifted by curious scavengers and later by county surveyors, unsettling discoveries came to light. Among the splintered wood and rusted nails lay fragments of bone, small, brittle, too delicate to belong to an adult. Nearby, a child's leather shoe, warped with age but unmistakably tiny. And hidden beneath fallen plaster, investigators found a collection of crude drawings scrawled in pencil on what had once been the wall of an upstairs bedroom. They were primitive, childlike sketches of family members, stick figures labeled Ma, Pa, and Sisters. Yet across several of the faces, heavy X marks had been drawn again and again, gouged deep enough to tear the plaster. It was as if the artist wanted those faces erased, obliterated, but could never finish the job. Neighbors who remembered the house spoke of hearing strange sounds before its final collapse. One man swore that on summer nights, when the windows still stood open, a foul odor drifted from inside, sweet, like rotting fruit, mixed with something far more sinister. "We told ourselves it was just dead animals in the walls," he recalled. "But when the bones came up later, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd smelled." Anthropologists who studied the artifacts suggested that the family's secrecy had turned inward, consuming itself until nothing remained but ruin. The drawings were not simply idle sketches, but the desperate expressions of a child who had no voice. The bones suggested lives that ended long before their time. And the crumbling house itself stood as a metaphor for bloodlines wound too tightly, eventually collapsing under their own weight. One local social worker described the scene bluntly. "What we found wasn't just decay. It was evidence of lives erased. The house wasn't abandoned. It was abandoned by choice, because too many memories were buried there. The wreckage was eventually cleared. Today only a patch of overgrown grass remains where the farmhouse once stood. No marker, no sign, just silence. But those who know the story say the land still feels heavy, as if it remembers what the family tried to hide. And a final, unanswerable question lingers. If bones and drawings surfaced in the collapse, how much more still lies buried beneath the soil, never to be unearthed? Stories have a way of surviving longer than the walls that contained them. When the farmhouse collapsed, its ruins fed whispers that spread through the hollow like wildfire. What had once been lived experience slowly slipped into something else. Folklore. Some claimed the family never existed at all, that the entire tale was an invention, a rural ghost story born of fear and isolation. Others swore the bloodline hadn't disappeared, only scattered, hidden in nearby towns. In diners, in church pews, in backyards where children played barefoot in the dirt, neighbors would lower their voices and say, "You can still see it," in their eyes. By the early 2000s, strange police reports began surfacing. Small incidents, easily dismissed but impossible to ignore. A pale child, barefoot, spotted wandering down a county road at midnight. No adults nearby. Deputies searched, but no record of the child was ever found. In another report, a farmer described seeing two figures crouched by his fence line. When his truck's headlights swept across the field, they scattered into the trees with unnatural speed. He told officers their faces looked wrong, like they weren't built right. Anthropologists studying Appalachian folklore catalogued these accounts, noting how legends often grow from kernels of truth. But in this case, the kernel may have been more than symbolic. Several investigators pointed out that missing birth records, unmarked graves, and family secrecy are not mere inventions. They are documented realities in rural America. The hollow story blurred the line between myth and memory. A retired social worker, interviewed in 2011, offered a chilling perspective. She remembered being warned as a young trainee never to visit a certain cluster of homes alone. They said those people were different, that they kept to themselves and you didn't ask questions. But I saw one of the children once, thin, silent, watching me from the doorway. It was like staring into the past. Skeptics argue these stories survive only because communities crave explanation for tragedy. A collapsed farmhouse, bones with no names, missing documents. It all invites the imagination to fill the gaps. Perhaps the wandering children were just runaways, the strange faces merely illness, and the silence nothing more than shame. But others insist there is too much smoke for there to be no fire. That the family's legacy didn't vanish when the house fell, but instead melted into the surrounding towns, carried forward by descendants who live quietly, unnoticed but marked forever. Even now, some locals refuse to walk the hollow after dark. They say if you listen closely, you can hear movement in the brush, quick footsteps that vanish when you turn your head. A few swear they've seen pale figures watching from the tree line, only to melt into the shadows. And so the question lingers, unanswered and unsettling. Was this the survival of folklore? Or America's darkest truth hiding in plain sight? History has a way of erasing names, but never the marks they leave behind. The patriarch at the center of this horror eventually vanished, whether through death, disappearance, or deliberate concealment, no one could say. His name was scrubbed from records, reduced to initials in court files, his presence remembered only in whispers. But names are not what keep stories alive. It was his cruelty, his dominance, his bloodline, that endured, staining the hollow long after his body was gone. The sisters never escaped. Their silence was their sentence, their submission their only form of survival. They left behind no testimony, no written word, no defense. Their voices were buried with them, their memories sealed by neighbors who preferred forgetting to facing the truth. And in their silence they became complicit, not by choice but by captivity. They were both victims and witnesses, forced into a cycle they could not break. Their children, frail, sickly, and short-lived, became shadows. Some never survived infancy. Others, hidden from the world, grew up nameless, without records, without acknowledgement. They existed only as rumors or as pale shapes glimpsed by those who dared approach the farmhouse. One child was remembered only for the sound of his coughing, echoing across the hollow on damp winter nights. Another was said to have drawn figures in the dirt, crude sketches of a family with the father's face crossed out. These fragments are all that remain of a generation swallowed by secrecy. As decades passed, the land itself seemed to hold the memory. The collapsed farmhouse, the rotted beams, the smell of damp earth heavy with decay, these became monuments to what had transpired. To outsiders, it was just another ruin of rural America. To locals, it was a scar. They avoided it, warning children not to wander near, claiming the soil itself was cursed. America moved on, eager to bury the scandal. Official investigations ended with files locked away or lost. The public turned its gaze elsewhere, refusing to confront what had happened in its own forgotten corners. In doing so, the nation allowed the story to fade, as if silence could erase the truth. But folklore has a longer memory than law, and trauma does not vanish simply because people choose to look away. Today, the Hollow's story survives as a warning. It reminds us of the dangers of isolation, of unchecked power, of secrecy sustained by silence. It is not just the story of one man who turned his sisters into brides, or of children born into shadows. It is the story of what happens when a community closes its eyes, when a nation decides some tragedies are easier forgotten than faced. And so the legacy endures, not in names, not in records, but in whispers. A patriarch who vanished, but left his mark. Sisters whose silence became their prison. Children erased before they could grow. A bloodline never meant to survive, yet impossible to forget. In the end, the Hollow did not bury its past. It carried it forward, a legacy stained in blood.